just before 5 o'clock. We are approaching an extremely powerful supercell thunderstorm southeast, or to the southeast of Wichita, near
just southeast of Winfield.
trying to get to the town of Winfield. We're on US 77, right?
Yeah. What?
On US 77.
Yep.
Winfield, Kansas. And we are hitting a wall of rain that this supercell is producing. We saw the anvil, and then suddenly
So are you turning?
it got extremely dark. Now it's pouring rain.
Just north of
Okay.
Winfield.
Well then we're
Just north of Winfield.
Northern edge.
Okay. Well we'll just turn around then.
Bye.
Okay. Bye. He's switching to the other storm.
What's wrong with this one?
Yeah. Well, we can be ahead of the other one. We're just going to be driving through this the whole entire time. He drove right through Winfield and said there wasn't any place to pull over.
Really?
Tornadoes. One is just into southwestern sections of Sedgwick County. The tornado warning for central Sedgwick County goes.
So what we're gonna do? We're gonna turn around and try to meet up with the southern flank of the other storm.
Hi everyone, this is meteorologist Nick Humphrey with the State of the Planet, and I'm joined by Antonio Reid, and thanks for being on with us. How you doing, Antonio?
I'm doing great. How are you, Nick?
Doing good. There's been a lot going on as far as climate change and other big news. I know the January is the warmest on record. It's been very, very abnormal heat in Europe and Siberia. It's been a lot going on.
Yeah, I think that we're really starting to see our climate in full swing transition. I think that it's coming to the point where we're not just saying that this is, I mean, at least for people who are aware, it's not that we're saying this is an abnormal winter. We're simply saying that winter is now in transition. That winter, as we've known it before, is forever gone. The weather here is turning. I think we have to appreciate moving into a subtropical climate. That's our transition currently. For me in North Carolina, that means that the winters have become increasingly mild. Spring has sprung already for us. Trees are blooming, flowers are coming out, and we just got snow today as well, because we're getting these whiplash effects. So there is a lot going on everywhere around the world.
Yeah, it seems like you live in, I guess you live in an area that would be considered the sort of the South. It seems like the South overall has been abnormally warm to hot since last summer. I mean, it just really hasn't given up. Even going into wintertime, the amount of heat that's been in the South, I think there is almost 90-degree temperatures in parts of Florida. People think of Florida as a warm place all year round, but really getting to 85, 90 degrees in South Florida is that's pretty hot for this time of year. So it's been something else, and And I know there's also been a lot of flooding in parts of Tennessee. It seems like the weather is almost repeating itself in a lot of places. There's a lot of parts of Tennessee that were flooded last year that are getting more flooding. Parts of Mississippi and the Mississippi River are flooding again. There's been a lot going on down the south. Tornadoes, which aren't in and of themselves unusual in the south, even in February, but there's been some really intense, severe weather down there. You talked about how it seems to be spring is sprung in your area. Why don't you go a little bit more into detail about what you've seen?
Yeah. Well, it's not just what you're seeing, but what you're hearing. I'm not even sure at this point if the birds, the normal, regular migratory birds, have left. I mean, I have no idea at this point because I'm hearing them year round. I've not seen any fireflies in the last 2 years. That's just absolutely unbelievable to me that I've not seen any fireflies in the last 2 years that I can remember. I'm seeing, the dogwood blooming sooner than it's supposed to. And I don't know the names of all the different types of trees, but we should not have any blooming in late January, early February, mid-February. This is absolutely absurd. And we're still getting hit by these freakish snowstorms to come in because, as you know, Nick, a lot of our weather here in the South is greatly contributed to or by the Gulf Stream. And so we have a lot of moisture from the north, and those things kind of collide, so we can get this late springtime snow effect that's been going on. But this is amidst periods where we have sometimes low summertime temperatures. It's gotten as high as 80 degrees in January, February. And it's also gotten as low as 20. So it's so destabilizing that it can trigger the plants to bloom and then snow on them weeks later.
Yeah, and I know you've in previous states of the planet you've talked about, and I've talked about it too. It's not just about the average temperatures rising; it's also these wild extremes in temperature. And living here in Nebraska, it's kind of almost part of the culture to know that you're going to be dealing with temperatures that go wild and have wild variability. But I mean, I know even in the past couple of years, we've had cases where we had a record high in the low 80s one day, and then it snowed the next day. Extremes you'd almost expect in, say, the mountains or something, not in the lowland plains of Nebraska. Even for this area, that seemed really ridiculous. And I know you've talked about having experiences like that where you live. And it's kind of interesting going back and forth, trying to sort of understand climate change from a personal perspective. Not just the global average numbers and all of this, but also just what do you observe? What do you sense? What do other people observe or sense? Because even people that don't necessarily believe in climate change or think climate change is happening, they report things that and even they know is sort of off the mark. It's off kilter, but they won't necessarily admit, maybe because of politics or the politicization of it, that it's climate change that's had an effect on their lives, their livelihood, on just the observation of what they see and how the plants, the animals deal with the weather, the changing weather conditions over time.
That's one of the things that I was going to mention in conjunction with the spread of disease is that we see that the spread of disease is almost in some sense a direct response to the movement of animals, the response that animals have to climate change, because the vectors for disease are also moving along with the changes in climates and spirit locations. So we're going to see the spread of things like malaria, the spread of things like dengue, the spread of things like Zika. So these are the things that we should be prepared for. These type of things are going to move into areas where they haven't been before. As climates warm, allowing certain vectors to move increasingly into the mid-latitudes and further north. So this is something that I think that ultimately is going to cause a lot of impact on our society as the climate continues to warm. And I think NASA recently released data that showed that the last 5 years has been 1.1 to 1.2 degrees Celsius warmer than the 1880 baseline. So we are, pretty far along into this warming period now.
Yeah, and it's interesting because most of that warming has occurred in just the time I've been alive. I turned 36 in May. I'm not old at all, but much of that surge of warming has been since the 1980s. It's been very dramatic what's happened to the planet, the altering of the planet's atmospheric chemistry to the point that you have the destruction of ice, the destruction of sea ice, land ice, glaciation, the polar ice caps. You have the greening of the Arctic, which has impacts on the permafrost and the release of carbon from the permafrost that will exacerbate global warming even more. There was a recent study showing that most of the coral reefs on this planet may be gone by 2100 or sooner if we get to 4 degrees of warming. I mean, that's the average in the business as usual modeling, RCP 8.5 as they call it, representative concentration pathway. You will have most of the coral reefs on the planet going extinct because it's simply the waters are simply too hot to support them. So, it's kind of hard to sometimes grasp, how profound the changes have been in just the time that me and you have been alive. But then realize it's going to be, 2 or 3 times more dramatic in terms of the temperature change, but so much more altered will be the ecosystems on this planet, and a lot of species may not make it because the changes are happening so quickly.
I do want to bring this up because we were talking about this in an earlier conversation, but I mentioned that I talked to my friend, Dr. Greg Marlin, author of IPCC 07, and he's born 50 years before me, 2 days 50 years and 2 days after me. And, so it was interesting because when he was born in 1942, the Earth was about 0.4 degrees Celsius warmer than the 1880 baseline. But by the time that I'm born in 93, the world warms to about 0.8 degrees Celsius warmer than the 1880 baseline. Today, it's about 1.2, and by 2030, it's going to be 1.5, 1.6. He is going to witness, by his entire lifespan, the global average temperature quadruple. But what's interesting about this is that, which this is absolutely fantastic, no living organism should ever see the global average temperature quadruple in its own lifespan. That's absolutely magnificent that can actually be said. But what's more is that, and I know that you're looking at this and keeping up with this, is that the coupled carbon modeled intercomparison project, the CMIP-6, shows that our current trajectory is going to yield almost 7.6 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. That's 7 times. Well, I should say in magnitude.
Yeah.
Where we currently are, and that's what we're rushing to. So this is going to have extreme and dynamic impacts on global, local, regional weather systems.
Yeah.
And I remember in our last conversation, we're talking about signal detection and attribution science, how climate change is showing up in our day-to-day weather.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's well, by long before that, the weather in most places or every place on the planet will be completely altered. It will be alien, the climate. And I've been working on a project actually for local climate projection for select cities in the United States. I take from different sources that have information on average temperatures, extreme heat, cold conditions, sea level rise for coastal locations, and I put it together into a product that a presentation that I post on my YouTube channel, and I post that on my Facebook weather page too periodically. So folks that follow me on Facebook will get those information when I post those videos. But one thing that I notice when I do these things is just how alien the climate and the weather really will become in these places. Like I look at one location that might have an average of like 1 or 2 days a year where the heat index on average is above 105, and then by the late 21st century, that's expected to be 30 to 40 days above 105 or something ridiculous. And you're trying to think, how do you grow food in these climates? How do you stay cool in these climates? How do the animals deal with the heat? And you realize very quickly that you're looking at isn't just a bunch of numbers. It's a catastrophe. That's what you're looking at. You're looking at a catastrophe, an ecosystem catastrophe, a civilization catastrophe, and it makes it more when I do these presentations, it makes the situation a little more real because I'm really understanding the implications of what this is what this area will look like with 4 degrees of warming. Well, global warming. Well, 4 degrees of global warming will be like 7 degrees locally for that particular location, for example, and it'll be basically a desert where it used to be a tropical or a temperate location. And I mean, it's just where are people, animals, the plants supposed to do in that kind of situation when you're changing the climate so rapidly, so quickly? There's nothing like this in the past 65 million years. I mean, the only thing faster than this would be an asteroid impact, which made it dramatically colder in just a year or two. This is making it dramatically hotter over the course of a couple hundred years, and really most of that is, like I said, has been in the past 30, 40, 50 years, and much of it will continue to be in another 20, 30, 40, 50 years. This dramatic shifts that I fear that many species on this planet won't be able to handle. They'll try to evolve as fast as they can, but it may outpace a lot of species.
No, yeah, I definitely agree. I think that's already underway. We're looking at, if Dr. Greg Marlin told me, he lives in Boone, which is in the mountains here. He said, well, I've seen more fireflies up here than I've ever seen before. because they've all ran to the mountains. And this is incredible. I mean, this is unbelievable. And this will be out in the literature, maybe 2 or 3, maybe 4 years from now, because the literature always takes, longer to catch up.
Right.
But you're seeing, I mean, this is happening at the speed of light now. Our ecosystems are transforming before our very eyes. These are not, to turn a phrase, we're not in Kansas anymore. Everything is really getting and going now, and so we're seeing these most dynamic impacts on what the average daily temperature looks like, but also equally important, if not more important, what the average nighttime high temperature looks like, what that means for soil, what that means for the first frost of the year. I mean, all these things that, we used to make fun of Native Americans for and other indigenous cultures for their understanding of these planetary alignments and bonds and mechanics. And I don't even like to use these type of words to describe how intricate our planet is. All these things have been shattered. They've just been eviscerated. Everything is in disarray. And so you're seeing that now in the typhoons. You're seeing that now in the wildfires. You're seeing that now in just, there are no normal days. I mean, can you really consider, people don't understand, the average does not dictate the norm. Okay. Right. So talking about, and particularly an average that's shifting, what does it mean that we're having a 50-degree day in February? And, 53 is the, average high normally. But what does it mean that we have a 53 day? Weather, climate is the context, okay? So the weather is so crazy every other week, it doesn't matter anymore if you're achieving average days or not, because it's about the stability and the predictability of the patterns. So the normal weather days have now themselves become a miss. It doesn't matter. There is no stability anymore outside.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that's really a big point to make is climate stability. Because while certainly these global average temperature anomaly thresholds, they do certainly matter in and of themselves, because even if you were to stabilize at 1.5 or stabilize at 2 degrees, you would be dealing with extremes that are consistent, but they're bad in a lot of ways. But at least what's happening and why it's happening, and hopefully would be able to predict it. But the rate of change in the climate system itself, the lack of stability means you're piling on not only the actual extremes that come with a certain global average temperature, but that global average temperature continues to rise, and the weather that you're getting as a result around that in the back, day to day, year to year, is constantly fluctuating. And so how do animals adapt to that? How do plants adapt to that if they're constantly being dealt with wild variability in temperatures, wild variability in precipitation? California is looking to go back into drought yet again. Much of their forests haven't recovered from the last drought, and then they got rained on. You have mudslides. Now it's dry again. Year to year, it changes rapidly. Here in parts of the plains, we're preparing for possibly more flooding. Even though it may not be as bad as it was last year, the damage that was done last year leaves a lot of places vulnerable to flooding because of damage to infrastructure that has yet to be repaired because of lack of money It's the economic damage as well. When there's no stability, how do you plan for that, and how do species evolve for that? They really can't, because it's simply going too fast, and the damage that's done accumulates over time because that damage is not able to be repaired fast enough before the next big strike.
Yeah, I think that's what's going on right now. Is a complete destabilization of the former Holocene climate. And it's interesting because people talk about this idea of stabilizing climate at 1.5, 2 degrees, but we also have to think about these metrics, right? So during the Paleocene, Eocene thermo maximum, 55 million years ago, there was an initial injection period of CO2 and greenhouse gas in the atmosphere for about 10 to 20,000 years. The total warming period was about 200,000 years. Okay, in the total increase, I believe, was between 5 to 8 degrees Celsius. We are going to 7 degrees Celsius in 100 years. It's not, there's not, like you say, there's nothing to really, it's so unfathomable. So the idea that we can halt at 1 degree, the fact of the rapidity at which we got to 1 degree is itself an immense danger. So not only is 1 degree itself immensely dangerous, but the fact that we got here so fast, and we continue to rise at this speed. And there are actual physical mechanisms in the climate system. You simply can't get to 1 degree, 1/2 degree, 2 degrees and turn it off.
Yeah.
You have to go to the next stable state. Okay. And that stable state could be at 4 degree, 5 degree, or warmer.
Yeah.
So people have to understand that, these idea of the Paris Climate Accords is really, in biblical terminology, a type of blasphemy. Of course, you cannot politically negotiate with the laws of physics.
Yeah.
Who cares if humans negotiate 1 degree, 1/2 degree, 2 degree? If you achieve those, you'll shoot the planet into a super accelerated heating. Regardless of what political debates and negotiations go on.
Yeah, and I mean that's the thing that I try to explain to people, and I think a lot of people can't handle that, because there's a degree of control that we want over the situation. I mean, like the whole Green New Deal thing, I like in and of itself, I don't have a problem with the idea of getting off fossil fuels and the idea of getting on renewables, but at the end of the day, it's a form of I don't know if it's like hospice care, but it's like doing something as a last ditch measure to try to prevent more damage from being done, but it doesn't stop the damage that's been done from getting worse. In other words, we have enough greenhouse gases in the atmosphere right now to melt most of the polar ice caps. Right, it's there right now. It's just a delay. There's a climate delay. The climate takes a lot of time to respond, but for me, most of the coastal cities of the world are doomed. It's just self-evident. I don't I don't really even think about it or anymore, because it's just self-evident. The planet going to a hothouse state, to me, is self-evident. It's not something that we can avoid, there are some scientists that, especially some that get more politically involved, that go to these climate accords and stuff like that, that just think about the human aspect, the human control of it. But I mean, it just, the paleoclimatology doesn't really seem to fit with this idea that you just turn off the spigot and everything stops. It just keeps going. It may take a long, the rate of change may level off and may not be as dramatic anymore, but it's inevitable that you're going to get to a state that makes parts of the planet unlivable for humans simply because it's too hot or too dry, or some other state where you can't grow food. So the land's unusable practically. And so, we can talk about things that are in human control and make those changes, try to help humanity, help other species, and I have no problem with that. But I think there has to be a sort of reality about how much we can actually do. And I see articles like, how we stopped climate change in 2030, or how we stopped climate change in 2050, or and you're not going to stop climate change. Climate change and global warming is going to continue. It's just a matter of how do humans choose to tinker with what they can control, so that maybe things don't end up quite as bad, quite as fast, and hope for the best. That's basically all I see that can be done. So I mean, yes, sir. Go to renewables. Actually, but also there needs to be reality that if you're going to switch to a completely different fuel source, you're going to have to burn more fossil fuels in order to do it. To build an entire infrastructure that really has to be global. You can't have, fossil fuels burning and growth in the developing world. The developed world has to help the developing world smoothly transition to renewables themselves, as well as the developed world needs to pick up much of the tab for that, having used all of these resources in the first place that it got us to the point that we're in now. But there has to basically be realities for exactly what the expectations will be if we do these dramatic changes that humans can control, and an understanding that there's a lot that humans simply can't control. We just have to deal with that because, like as you said, the laws of physics aren't negotiable.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. At this point, I think people really can't, because we think about living memory, and everyone that we know has been born since at least the 1920s. There's no one on the planet, probably very few people on the planet that were born for 1920. And that's kind of the climate of our living memory. Mm-hmm. And it's so hard for anyone today to just understand 1.5 degrees is something totally different than any of that. It's something totally different than any of that. And what happened in Antarctica?
Yeah.
70-degree temperatures. I mean, we are going to witness. It's so, the West Antarctic ice sheet is just going to collapse into the sea. And that's going to have global implications. But my friend Greg Marlin is convinced now that governments will begin issuing a geoengineering program to reflect sunlight to slow global temperatures, the rise of global temperatures. But interestingly enough, and he agreed as I was saying this, that is just as catastrophic that if you try to halt, think about this. We are moving the global atmosphere at the speed of millions of years every decade. If you halt the global average temperature, that means you reverse that process. That's like driving a car into the wall at 100 miles an hour and reversing the car into a wall at 100 miles an hour.
Yeah.
So we'll completely shatter, just in the reverse, the weather systems and global ecology.
Yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, we're having the greening of the Arctic. Imagine you suddenly make the Arctic freezing cold like it's supposed to be. You've set off a chain reaction of events that you may not anticipate that ends up causing harm to ecosystems that we're actually trying to adapt the other way.
Yeah.
And going back in reverse, because in order to get to get to a pre-industrial state again and have ice refreeze up in the Arctic and everything else, you really have to go not only in reverse, you have to really get colder than pre-industrial to compensate for what was done before. Maybe to the level of the little ice age or something like that, something akin to that. I mean, little ice age was very regionally based in Europe and in parts of Northeast North America. It wasn't a global event, but you'd have to go backwards to something like that in order to counter the effects of the damage that was done in the global warming period, but you might cause damage ecologically in the process. That's why I've never really been fond of geoengineering, because I don't think we really grasp the effect that changes will have on species. I hear stuff about dumping iron or some kind of fertilizer into like 10% of the global ocean to spur the growth of algae to try to sequester carbon. All I can think about is, well, what is that going to do to all the life that lives in that part of the ocean, to have a ton of a ridiculous amount of algae growth in the ocean? I'm not even a biologist. I just play these things in my head and think, what could go wrong? Because that's what you're supposed to be thinking. You're supposed to be skeptical and think, okay, we're thinking about what can go right, the sequestering of carbon, but what could go wrong? Well, that's effects on the climate, the species. I think we're in such a rush to try to save ourselves, so to speak, that we're not really thinking through, well, what will geoengineering practices really do to the weather, the day-to-day weather, the climate, the species that are trying to adapt going the other direction, this global warming regime that we're in. What effects will that have? And I don't think we really understand what those effects will be. I mean, you'd have to have entire climate conferences just on global geoengineering in order to even attempt to understand, have the greatest minds on earth come together to try to glean into that from different fields: biology, climatology, meteorology, ecology, because there's just no way otherwise you could possibly do such schemes ethically. I don't think it's a good idea at all.
So at this point, I mean, I think about like the fireflies, right? So they've moved to the moon to initiate a global engineering project where we lower the global average temperature by 1 degree. Are the fireflies going to get back in time? I mean, they're totally not adapted for that weather. They are
Yeah.
increasingly now, because the weather in Boone is becoming increasingly like it used to be down here in the Piedmont. But this is this is what you're talking about. Species, the planet is not just like this machine that you can just tinker with and see what happens, because you know the physical properties, right?
Yeah.
Also, laws of ecology and biology we have to respect as well. And so these schemes don't do that. We have to basically realize we've been engaged in a project. I was watching a documentary by the Climate State, and the narrator, which is playing the voice of the planet, talks about the formation of our cities as a industrial crystallization, right? That these growths of concrete and steel are spreading out, just shredding the environment, and then surrounding them are these vast agricultural landscapes for industrial farming. And then there's where we have our sacrifice zones, where we dig into the planet for our rare earth elements and for our natural resources. And all this is going on, and we see that happen, and we're kind of responding in kind of right. So the problem with the LA sprawl is not that we should have electric cars. If you can look at a map of LA and say the problem here with human development is electric cars, then you don't really. So one of the things that we're trying to, well, one of the things that we're trying to focus on in finding these solutions is that any real solution to this is going to come with the contraction of human society. That planet can withstand some human impact. Is more than the planet can handle. Do have CO2 burden. So we've exhausted, I guess, our budget for that. And you're right. At 420 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, we're already at devastatingly dangerous levels of carbon dioxide.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Let's go back a little bit. We were talking about diseases, and obviously we have this new disease that seems to have risen into the human population, the coronavirus disease. It's kind of interesting because if you wanted to know how the world would respond to an outbreak of some kind, because obviously we've been worried about tropical diseases spreading into the mid latitudes. We've been worried about new viruses, or at least new to humans, coming out of the permafrost. This is pretty much it, because it seems to be a fairly serious disease, a fairly serious illness that's killing people and making people very sick. And the global response to it has been sort of patchwork. China. There's questions about China's reporting of cases versus what's happening in China. There's issues with how well it's being detected in many countries, even the United States. The future is now, and right now, humanity, I'm not sure, really has a handle on how to deal with either new or even known disease vectors spreading to other parts of the world because of all the politics that's involved in wanting to protect economics over necessarily the lives and health of people. What do you think about what you've seen so far in terms of the response to this illness and China and the politics behind it? Maybe if you've noticed.
Well, I think about this from a point of view of governing in crises.
Yeah.
And that's clearly the view that the Chinese have. What we saw is the shutdown of cities like Guangzhou, Shenzhen, totally quarantined cities of tens of millions of people effectively.
Yeah.
Absolutely stunning how the Chinese were able to do this. I think in some respects maybe gone too far. But it's very interesting. It'd be hard to achieve that same type of level of public cooperation in the West. But one of the things that we should be mindful of is that our cities are going to be huge transport vessels for viruses and diseases and bacteria, whatever it may be that we have to deal with. And what we're seeing, for example, is like increased rain patterns. Why would that necessarily increase the spread of disease? Well, for example, increased rain patterns may be leading to increased puddling. Increased puddling may lead to increased pestilence, like mosquitoes, and they serve as vectors, viruses, and diseases. So we start to see things like that, even in Africa, where places are more subtropical climates, where perhaps fruit is plentiful. Increased rain causing more increases in the amount of fruit vegetation increasing the amount of more pests and the oncoming of apes and other large animals and transference disease jumping from one species to another. So we're going to continue to see a expansion of these viruses into our systems. What's going to be interesting is when we get that virus that kills 30% or 20-30% of everyone that contracts it. The way the world has globalized, I mean, really, it is going to be absolutely absurd. Particularly if it's airborne. And contact.
Yeah, I mean this disease, this coronavirus strain, nobody really knows for sure how deadly it actually is in totality because the outbreak is in progress. But there's been estimates of 1%, 2%. For comparison, because people think these numbers are small, they're really not.
Yeah.
For comparison, the Spanish flu fatality rate was around 2.5%, maybe a bit higher. So it could be not as bad as that, or potentially as bad. So, but the Spanish flu wasn't like a potential extinction level event. In other words, it was disruptive. I mean, obviously it was a horrible tragedy, and clearly we're hoping that this is not that even at that level. But yes, if you're dealing with a strain of something that was in like this coronavirus. In fact, it may have come from bats, I've heard. If you have something that comes from a bat or an ape or some other species that had an immunity to it or a partial immunity, and it just jumps into the human population, it's more akin to Middle East respiratory syndrome or Ebola, which is like 40 to 60% fatality rate, and it's as contagious as this coronavirus actually is. Very contagious, it appears. If it's as contagious, then you're dealing with a whole lot of people dying how do you respond to that? And I'm not sure realistically we have a way of dealing with that. And you talk about some of the factors as the climate warms that could impact the vectors of disease. Another thing is you increasingly have more and more people moving into cities all around the world. So you have increased population density, and that may have played a role in why China is getting hit so hard, and we're seeing increasing community transmission right now in Japan and South Korea. I mean, these are places that have very dense population centers, and obviously, if this intensifies in the United States, you worry for places like LA, San Francisco, New York, Chicago, high population centers where everyone is just packed. And, and if you have a virus that is easily transferred from person to person or has a vector that allows to do that, like a mosquito or something, that's another thing that one has to worry about as you deal with a warmer climate, is just the transference of disease.
Yeah, I think that's going to be one of the major impacts on human society. But in the 2030s, we're really going to, the difference is going to be, this is not going to be like a decadal event. This is going to be like the everyday scene. The countries are going to be dealing with emergent public health crises. Countries are going to be dealing with emergent infrastructure failure. Countries are going to be dealing with biblical storms all at the same time. Famine induced by weather weirding, weather wilding. Immigration crises. So that's what we're talking about here when we talk about the breakdown of human systems, is that these pressures are mounting, and listen to the things that the World Health Organization has said in response to climate change. Look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's chapter on the spread of disease. These things are now in motion, and we have to understand that this is a process, and these processes can't be stopped. So in large part, there's so much inertia that we're going to see these movements in vectors of disease, because now that's just a movement of the climate transition.
Right.
So the vectors are going to follow where the climate is suitable. So as the climate transitions, we're going to start to see these things. And they're going to be impacting, as you say, our increasingly more urbanized areas. And urbanization, of course, has really taken off in China, which is why they've had the type of centralized, authoritative response that they had.
Yeah.
And like I say, what's going to be interesting is to witness when these diseases become, the fatality numbers do start coming closer to 10, 15, 20%. And they start finding their ways into the international community, into our international system. What is that going to mean in terms of national militarization? What is that going to do to the relationship of countries, between countries? What is that going to do in terms of making sure that countries continue to get foreign aid as they do? What is that going to do in terms of
Can you still hear me?
So what is that going to do in terms of foreign aid? What is that going to do in terms of immigration status? We're already talking about a situation in the United States where we're seeing Latin American countries develop these caravans into our country. Wait until you start to see increasing climate distress, inducing larger numbers of the population to come north, and we have these public health threats of the spread of disease.
So, we talk about all these dire things, and they're things that don't really have Everyone talks about climate solutions. It's not. They don't really have solutions. So is our only, well, this may be my opinion. So I guess I'm asking you: is our only solution, if you will, to be sort of a retreating form of adaptation, where we're just trying to adapt to the situation that we know is happening now and in the near term, and once that deteriorates, we can't adapt to it any longer, we had tried to adapt in other ways. Is that the best we can do? It seems to me that it is the best we can do. Obviously, we can try to reduce emissions and not have so much additional damage being done, but would you think that that's pretty much what we're stuck with, is a form of moving adaptation targets, where we have to do the best we can with what we got in the time that we have?
I think that would be admirable, but honestly, the collapse now, particularly due to sea level, is so fast. It's so fast, and we built up so much on our global coastlines that I can't even believe it's people looked at. Have you ever seen The Day After Tomorrow?
Oh yeah.
With the large wave that hit New York.
Yeah.
So people think that sea level needs to be something like that in order for the type of reality that I'm talking about to come into existence, and that's not at all true.
Right.
If the sea level rises by 3 feet, that's a global catastrophe on an epic proportion. Hundreds of millions of people, 500 million, 800 million, maybe 1-2 billion people have to move inland.
Yeah.
And this will all kind of happen roughly simultaneously. Okay? So dealing with the type of large-scale movement is going to cause schisms within countries and schisms among countries and schisms between countries. So trying to think about this. In the United States alone, over 70 million people will be immediately impacted if the sea level is to rise by 2.5 feet by 2040.
Yeah.
So we're talking about complete abandonment of coastal infrastructure would occur. Complete devaluation in coastal real estates. Where would these people go? Think about that.
Yeah. Especially given the state of many other countries, they can't take the influx of people, or they, in many cases, don't want them. There may be issues with racism or other problems, hate, pre-existing social issues. And I mean, yeah. And where does everyone go?
So that means sometime between 2030 and 2045, 70 million Americans are going to be catastrophically impacted by climate change. Sea level rise. To think about that alone is going to be so magnificent that it's hard to think about. Do we have enough time to give up the suburbs? Do we have enough time to contract our cities down to cities centers? Do we have enough time to restore the biosphere? I don't think we even have a collapse that's happening now so fast, I think. And when I say collapse, I don't mean to say that in a type of doomerish sense. I mean, literally, the systems for which human civilization are predicated on, the stability of the weather system, the predictability of the weather system so that we can grow food, the stability of our shorelines. All of this is now so much in question that it's hard to see that we can respond actually now, even at a go approach, a global Marshall Plan, a global Green New Deal. I mean, that would be an admirable way to respond, and we should respond that way. But even still, there's so much damage and there's so much inertia that catastrophic impacts will still occur. And that's the part of the political apparatus that, people are talking about Michael Bloomberg. People are talking about Joe Biden. Nonsense. Bernie Sanders is clearly the only person with a platform that's even sensible to respond to what's happening. And that's simply not even enough. Point blank. So the idea here is that, at this point, our best bet is to contract because, the less area you cover, the less damage you'll receive. But what does that mean?
Yeah.
Because the available real estate that we've developed is where we live. It's where we shop. It's where we work. It's where we eat. It's how we eat. So that literally means people have to starve.
All right, we're coming up on the top of the hour now. Any rather heavy discussion, but I guess they're all heavy. You can't really avoid it. I guess the only final parting words I would have, and then I'll let you have the last word, Antonio, is the best we can do in this situation, I think, is just to do the admirable thing, whether it's vote for the candidate we know will help the cause the best we can to try to mitigate and adapt to climate change, whatever that means. Obviously, we know adaptation in a truest sense may be impossible. Try to adapt our lives to the best of our ability to, respect life and nature, and just appreciate what we have, knowing that, the collapse, as we describe it, is coming and is happening now, as you say. Any final parting words, Antonio?
It's really hard to know what to say because it's so surreal. That I keep on thinking back to when I was a kid. I keep on thinking back to the late 90s, the early 2000s. I was a really young kid, thinking between 5 and 6 years old. And I think to myself, that was like when the world was perfect, in a sense. Before I realized how big the world was and the seasons were, everything just made sense.
Yeah.
Today, nothing makes sense. And increasingly, things make less and less sense. So I think that's why it's important that we build community like this, that we talk about this. Because in our collective dialogue, we create social bonds. And I think that even in the absence of climate stability, we can have a collective social cognitive stability. So we should at least aim for that type of therapy in our lives. And as for the climate, I think we have to do everything we can. That's always the option. No matter where we are in this mess, we have to do everything that we can.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that's really the best that we can do. Well, it's been really great talking to you, Antonio, and it's been the State of the Planet with you've been listening to meteorologist Nick Humphrey and Antonio Reid, and I hope you all have a great night, and thanks for listening.
Thanks so much.
Time is just before 5 o'clock. We are approaching an extremely powerful supercell thunderstorm southeast, or to the southeast of Wichita, near.
Just southeast of Winfield.
We're trying to get to the town of Winfield. We're on US 77, right?
Yeah.
What?
On US 77.
Yep.
Winfield, Kansas. And we are hitting a wall of rain that this supercell is producing. We saw the anvil, and then suddenly
So are you turning?
it got
around
extremely dark. Now it's pouring rain.
Just north of
then, or? Okay.
Winfield.
Well then we're
Just
gonna,
north of
we're just
Winfield.
Northern edge.
Supercells out there. One is just to the
Gonna, okay. Well we'll just turn around then.
is down
Bye.
in parts of southern
Okay. Bye.
portions of
He's switching to the other storm.
What's wrong with this one?
Yeah. Well, we can be ahead of the other one. We're just gonna be driving through this the entire time. This one.
City and continues
He drove right through Winfield and said there wasn't any place to pull over.
supercell thunderstorms capable and have a history of producing tornadoes. One is just into southwestern sections of Sedgwick County. The tornado warning for central Sedgwick County goes.
So what we're gonna do? We're gonna turn around and try to meet up with the southern flank of the other storm.